Queen Maria of Yugoslavia died not with a scream, but with a terrifying silence. After days refusing food, her frail body finally gave out, collapsing beside an untouched plate, alone in a locked room. By the time they broke down the door, the once radiant queen was nothing but a weightless shadow on the floor, her face frozen in the calm of someone who had already left this world long before her heart stopped. This is the tragic story of the woman history forgot, the ghost queen of Yugoslavia. This is not a joke. It is the singularity point that destroyed a dynasty. And rising from the ashes of this absurd tragedy was a baby girl, Princess Alexandra of Greece. She was born 5 months after the funeral, entering a world that had already decided she was bad luck. She never saw her father's face, never heard his voice, and never felt his embrace. Instead, she inherited his ghost. From her very first breath, she was branded as the child of the curse. This is the autopsy of a cursed life, the story of a woman whose existence began with a freak accident and ended in a slow, agonizing suicide of the soul. To understand the mental collapse that would consume Alexandra in the luxury hotels of Paris in the 1960s, we must first act as detectives at the crime scene in the 1920s. We must investigate the original sin of her existence, for the poison that destroyed her life was injected long before she was born. The setting was the Tatoi Palace, the summer retreat of the Greek royal family, nestled in the pine forests outside Athens. It was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place of peace, away from the political storms of the capital. King Alexander I was 27 years old, the golden boy of a troubled nation. He had defied his family to marry the woman he loved, Aspasia Manos, and they were expecting a child. Life, for a brief, shining moment, was perfect. That perfection ended at 10 a.m. on October 2nd. Alexander was walking his German shepherd Fritz through the estate's vineyards. The steward of the property kept a pair of Barbary macaques, wild monkeys that roamed the grounds. The tragedy began with a primal chaotic instinct. The dog attacked the female monkey. Alexander, driven by the fatal weakness of his bloodline, a reckless impulsiveness, and a belief in his own invincibility, jumped into the fray to break up the fight. In his haste, he forgot about the male monkey. The male dropped from the trees like a hairy missile. It didn't just scratch him. It attacked with a ferocity that suggests something almost supernatural, biting deep into the king's leg and torso. Servants rushed in with sticks, beating the animals away, but the damage was done. Alexander stood up, his clothes torn, blood running down his leg. He laughed it off. "It's nothing," he told them. "Don't tell anyone." That silence was the true killer. Alexander treated a mortal wound like a minor scratch because he was terrified of looking weak. He didn't want the newspapers to report that the king of the Hellenes had been bested by a pet. So instead of rushing to a hospital for proper surgery, he went to his room and had the wounds cleaned with alcohol. He essentially signed his own death warrant in that moment of vanity. Within hours, the fever started. Sepsis set in. The bacteria from the monkey's mouth entered the royal bloodstream, and the bizarre curse shifted from animal violence to human incompetence. When the doctors finally arrived, they saw the gangrene setting in. The solution was medically obvious: amputate the leg. If they had cut off the leg on October 4th or 5th, Alexander would have lived. He would have been a one-legged king, but he would have been alive to hold his daughter. But they didn't cut. In the paralyzing atmosphere of the Greek court, no doctor wanted to be the man who crippled the king. They feared the political backlash more than they feared the infection. So they watched him rot. For 23 days, Alexander screamed in agony while his pregnant wife, Aspasia, sat by his side, utterly helpless. On October 25, 1920, the king died. I tell you this in such graphic detail because Alexandra of Greece was floating in the womb while this horror movie played out. Modern psychology tells us that the stress hormones of the mother affect the developing fetus. Alexandra spent her final months in utero bathing in her mother's terror, grief, and adrenaline. She wasn't just born into a period of mourning, she was physically constructed from it. The cortisol coursing through Aspasia's veins became the building blocks of Alexandra's nervous system. 5 months after the funeral, on March 25, 1921, Aspasia Manos gave birth to a girl in a quiet room in Athens. The date was symbolic, Greek Independence Day, but the atmosphere was anything but celebratory. Greece was in chaos. The government had fallen, the exiled King Constantine had returned, and the war with Turkey was escalating toward disaster. They named the baby Alexandra, after the father she replaced. In royal tradition, a posthumous child, one born after the father's death, is often viewed with a complex mix of pity and superstition. In the villages of Greece, the whispers began immediately. They called her the child of the monkey bite. They said she carried the bad luck that had killed the king. Imagine growing up with that narrative woven into your identity. Alexandra didn't have a father to protect her. She had a legend. And the legend was a nightmare. Every time she asked where her papa was, the answer wasn't that he died in war or succumbed to illness. The answer was that he was killed by a monkey. It is absurd. It is grotesque. It defies all logic. And this absurdity planted a seed in Alexandra's developing mind. The world is not safe. The world is random. Chaos can strike at any moment, even in your own garden. This is the root of her mental instability. If the most powerful man in the country can be taken down by a pet, then no one is safe. Alexandra developed a deep, vibrating anxiety that would never leave her. She learned before she could even speak that security is an illusion, a lesson that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The tragedy of Alexandra wasn't just biological, it was deeply political. When she was born, she was legally a bastard. The royal family, specifically her grandmother, Queen Sophia, despised her mother, Aspasia. They refused to recognize the secret marriage, and therefore Alexandra had no title. She was just Miss Alexandra Manos. For the first year of her life, she was a non-entity. While other European princesses lay in golden cribs, Alexandra lay in a house of uncertainty, her future hanging by a thread. Her mother had to fight like a lioness just to get Alexandra recognized. It wasn't until 1922, just before the monarchy collapsed again, that King Constantine finally relented and issued a decree. Alexandra was given the title Princess of Greece and Denmark. But even this victory came with a nuance of exclusion. She was a princess, but initially not a royal highness. She was in the family, but not of the family. She was a Category B royal, a concession rather than a celebration. This reinforced her sense of being an outsider. She was the ghost child, living in the shadow of the Tatoi Palace, surrounded by aunts and uncles who looked at her and saw only the mistake of her father. They looked at her face and saw the commoner's blood of her mother. Alexandra absorbed this rejection into her bones. Psychologists call it the wound of the unwanted. Even though her mother adored her, the extended family, the system, tolerated her at best. She learned that her existence was a problem to be solved, a constitutional crisis to be managed, rather than a joy to be celebrated. In 1924, when Alexandra was just 3 years old, the Second Hellenic Republic was declared and the royal family was kicked out of Greece. This is where the physical instability of her life began to mirror the mental instability. Alexandra became a refugee toddler. She didn't remember Greece. She had no memories of the Parthenon or the Aegean Sea. Greece became a fantasy land to her, a paradise she was expelled from because of the curse. She spent her childhood on trains, in hotels, and in borrowed villas across Italy, England, and France. She had no roots. If we were to visualize her childhood, we would see a little girl sitting on a trunk in a train station clutching a doll, watching her mother argue with customs officers, always moving, always running. This nomadic life is devastating for a child's psyche. A child needs consistency to feel safe, and Alexandra had none. Her only constant was her mother, Aspasia. And Aspasia, in her grief and ambition, was a complicated sanctuary. We must talk about Aspasia Manos. In other stories, she is the heroine who fought the system. But in this story, from Alexandra's perspective, Aspasia is the overbearing architect. Aspasia had lost everything: her husband, her home, her status. She poured all her unfulfilled ambition into Alexandra. She decided that Alexandra would not be a victim. Alexandra would be a queen. Aspasia raised Alexandra in a golden cage in Venice, at the villa known as the Garden of Eden. She dressed her like a doll, taught her perfect etiquette, and controlled every aspect of her life. Alexandra wasn't allowed to be a child. She was a project. She was the vessel for her mother's vindication. This created a drama-filled contradiction that tore Alexandra apart. She was raised to be powerful, yet she felt completely powerless. She was told she was special, yet she felt like a burden. She loved her mother, but she was suffocated by her. In her later memoirs, Alexandra wrote about the crushing weight of her mother's expectations. Aspasia wanted her to be strong like iron, to withstand the world that had rejected them. But Alexandra was fragile like glass. The more Aspasia pushed, the more cracks appeared in Alexandra's psyche. She began to develop a deep sense of inadequacy, a feeling that she could never be what her mother wanted, that she could never replace the magnificent king they had lost. By the time Alexandra was a teenager, the blueprint for her destruction was fully drawn. She carried a void where her father should have been, idealizing the dead King Alexander into a perfect figure that no living man could ever compete with. This ghost set her up for failure in any future relationship. For how can a mortal husband compete with a martyr? Stemming from the randomness of the monkey bite, she developed a deep-seated fear of chaos. This manifested as obsessive-compulsive tendencies, a desperate need for control in a world that felt fundamentally unsafe. This need for control would later mutate into anorexia, the ultimate tragic attempt to control one's own body when everything else is spinning out of hand. Compounding this was the imposter syndrome of being a half-breed royal, constantly feeling the need to prove her worth, and the trauma of exile, leaving her homeless in her soul. The bizarre curse was not magic. It was a chain reaction of trauma. The monkey bit the father died, the mother was traumatized, the child was born into fear, the child was exiled, and the child was pressured to fix the family's destiny. As the 1930s came to a close, and the dark clouds of World War II gathered over Europe, Alexandra was a beautiful, melancholic, fragile statue waiting to be toppled. She was about to be pushed onto the world stage, about to meet another king who was just as broken as she was. She would mistake his brokenness for compatibility, believing that two tragedies could make a romance. She was wrong. It was simply a collision that would shatter them both. Venice is a city built on illusions. It is a place where palaces float on water, where masks conceal identities, and where the decaying past is more real than the present. It was the perfect setting for the second act of Alexandra's tragedy. If the first act was the violent horror of the monkey bite in Athens, the second act was the silent, suffocating beauty of the Venetian lagoon. In the 1930s, a teenage girl could often be seen wandering the lush, overgrown paths of a villa on the island of Giudecca. The villa was ironically named the Garden of Eden. To the outside world, this girl was a fairy tale princess living in paradise. She was beautiful, she was royal, and she was surrounded by flowers and servants. But if you looked closer, you would see the sadness in her eyes. You would see that the high walls of the garden were not there to keep the world out, but to keep her in. This is the story of Alexandra's glass menagerie, a fragile, artificial world created by her mother, where she was polished, pruned, and perfected like a prize orchid, waiting to be sold to the highest bidder in the royal marriage market. To understand the isolation that would eventually drive Alexandra to the brink of suicide, we must physically locate her childhood. After being exiled from Greece, her mother, Aspasia Manos, used the last of her financial resources to purchase a small palace on the island of Giudecca in Venice. The Garden of Eden was a property famous for its English-style gardens, a rare explosion of green in a city of stone and water. It was undeniably beautiful, but for a child, it was a fortress. Venice itself is an island, and Giudecca is an island separated from the main city by a wide canal. Alexandra was living on an island within an island, doubly removed from reality. Inside this golden cage, time stood still. While the rest of Europe was marching toward fascism and war, life at the Garden of Eden was a performance of 19th century etiquette. There were no other children to play with. There were no messy, chaotic games of tag. There was only silence, interrupted by the sound of piano practice and French lessons. Alexandra wrote later that she felt like a piece of furniture in her mother's house, something to be dusted and admired but never truly heard. She created imaginary friends to populate the empty rooms. She talked to the trees. She developed a rich, intense inner life because her outer life was so terrifyingly empty. This retreat into fantasy was a survival mechanism, but it was also a dangerous habit. It blurred the lines between what was real and what was imagined, a psychological fragility that would haunt her when she finally had to face the brutal realities of the world. The warden of this prison was, of course, her mother. We must tread carefully when analyzing Aspasia Manos during this period. It is easy to paint her as the villain, the mommy dearest of royalty. But the detective's view reveals a more complex motive. Aspasia was a woman driven by a singular, desperate terror, the fear of irrelevance. She had lost her husband, her country, and her crown. The only asset she had left was Alexandra. In Aspasia's mind, Alexandra was not just a daughter. She was a vindication. If Alexandra could become a great queen, then Aspasia's suffering, the humiliation by Queen Sophia, the poverty, the exile, would all be worth it. So Aspasia ran the household like a military academy disguised as a finishing school. She scrutinized every aspect of Alexandra's existence. Her posture had to be perfect. Her French accent had to be flawless. Her clothes had to be impeccable. Aspasia was projecting her own thwarted ambition onto the blank canvas of her daughter. She constantly reminded Alexandra of who she was. You are a princess of Greece. You are the daughter of a hero king. She fed Alexandra a diet of myths. She told her stories about Alexander I that elevated him to sainthood, creating an impossible standard for any future man in Alexandra's life to live up to. But this perfectionism came with a heavy psychological price. Alexandra learned that her mother's love was conditional. She was loved when she was beautiful. She was loved when she was obedient. She was loved when she looked like a queen. but who loved her when she was just a scared, lonely girl. The message was clear. The real Alexandra was flawed and shameful, linked to the monkey bite and the curse. The royal Alexandra was the only version allowed to exist. This bifurcation of the self is a classic precursor to the mental health struggles she would later face. She was learning to hate her true self and worship the mask she was forced to wear. Alexandra's education was a tour of Europe's most exclusive boarding schools. But even this was a form of homelessness. She was sent to finishing schools in Paris and Florence, institutions designed to churn out obedient wives for aristocrats. But Alexandra was different from the other girls. The other girls had homes to go back to for Christmas. They had fathers who sent them allowances. Alexandra had the Garden of Eden, a place of shadows, and a mother who was constantly counting pennies to keep up appearances. At school, the curse followed her. Children can be cruel, and the story of the monkey bite was famous. Alexandra was looked at with a mixture of curiosity and pity. She was the girl with the dead father. She was the girl whose mother isn't really a queen. She felt the sting of her ambiguous status keenly. She wasn't fully royal enough for the snobs, but she was too royal for the commoners. She floated in the middle, belonging nowhere. During these years, we see the first signs of her fatal weakness, her inability to cope with reality. Instead of making friends, she withdrew. She became known as the Ice Princess, cold and distant, but inside, she was burning with anxiety. She developed obsessive rituals to create a sense of order. She would arrange her clothes just so. She would worry excessively about her health. She was terrified of getting sick, terrified of accidents. The trauma of her father's death, a random, chaotic infection, made her obsessed with cleanliness and control. The seeds of her later anorexia were being planted in these lonely dormitories. Watered by the tears, she refused to cry in public. By the late 1930s, Alexandra was 18. She was breathtakingly beautiful, tall, slender, with dark, tragic eyes that seemed to hold the weight of Greek history. It was time for her debut. Aspasia brought her to the social capitals of Europe, Paris, London, Athens. This was the sales pitch. Aspasia was displaying her creation to the royal market. But Alexandra felt like a fraud. She was dressed in couture gowns, but she knew that back in Venice the paint was peeling off the walls of their villa. She knew her mother was selling family heirlooms to pay for the hotel bills. This gilded poverty created a deep sense of insecurity. She felt that at any moment, the facade would crack, and everyone would see that they were just two poor women playing dress-up. There is a specific tragedy in being a royal without a kingdom in the 1930s. You are a relic. The world was modernizing. Fascism and communism were rising. The concept of princesses was becoming obsolete. Alexandra felt this obsolescence. She often wondered what her purpose was. She wasn't trained to work. She wasn't trained to think. She was trained to be an ornament. And what happens to ornaments when the house catches fire? It was during this period that Alexandra began to view marriage not as a romantic union, but as an escape hatch. She didn't dream of Prince Charming. She dreamed of a passport. She dreamed of a man who would take her away from her mother's suffocating control, away from the Garden of Eden, away from the pressure to be perfect. She wanted to be saved. And this desire to be saved is a dangerous thing. It blinds you. It makes you project your fantasies onto the first person who offers you a hand. It makes you mistake a fellow drowning victim for a lifeguard. As 1939 approached, the glass walls of Alexandra's menagerie began to shake. World War II was inevitable. For most people, the war was a terrifying threat, but for Alexandra, it was strangely clarifying. It shattered the artificial routine of her life in Venice. When Italy entered the war on the side of the Axis, Alexandra and Aspasia became enemies of the state. As Greeks, they were allied with the British. They had to flee. The Garden of Eden was abandoned. The sanctuary was lost. They became refugees once again, boarding trains, crossing borders, running from the encroaching darkness. This second exile re-traumatized Alexandra. It triggered the memories of her early childhood, the instability, the fear, but it also threw her into the path of destiny. They fled to London, the gathering place for the exiled royals of Europe. London was a city under siege, a city of blackouts and bombs, but it was also a city of desperate, intense life. In London, the glass menagerie was broken. Alexandra was no longer isolated on an island. She was thrust into a community of displaced kings and queens, all huddled together in hotels, waiting for the news from the front. It was here, in the chaos of the Blitz, that she would meet the man who would seal her fate. But before we get to the romance, we must acknowledge the psychological state of Alexandra as she arrived in England. She was a woman constructed of trauma. She had no solid sense of self. She was a reflection of her mother's ambition and her father's tragedy. She was a vacuum waiting to be filled. She was desperate for connection, desperate for stability, and completely ill-equipped to find it. She walked into the 1940s like a sleepwalker walking toward a cliff. She thought she was escaping the curse of the monkey bite. She thought she was leaving the ghosts of Greece behind. But she didn't realize that the curse wasn't in the geography. It was in her blood. It was in the way she viewed the world, as a place of danger where love always ends in death. She was looking for a hero to rewrite her story. Instead, she was about to meet another victim. She was about to meet a boy king who had lost his father to an assassin, just as she had lost hers to a beast. They were two orphans of history, drifting toward each other in the storm. And when two broken people collide, they don't fix each other. They shatter. London, 1942. The Blitz has turned the city into a landscape of craters and blackout curtains. The sky is gray, filled with barrage balloons and the drone of Luftwaffe engines. In the gilded lobby of the Grosvenor House Hotel, a young woman sits waiting. She is a princess without a country, a daughter without a father, a beauty without a purpose. Across the room, a young man watches her. He is 20 years old, wearing a uniform that looks too big for his slender shoulders. He is a king, but he has no throne. This is the meeting of Alexandra of Greece and King Peter II of Yugoslavia. History books call it a royal romance. The tabloids called it a fairy tale. But looking back with the cold eye of a detective, it was neither. It was a collision of two sinking ships. They were two traumatized orphans drifting in the wreckage of Europe, clinging to each other because they had nothing else to hold on to. This is the story of a wedding celebrated in the ashes of a dying world, a union that was doomed before the ink on the certificate was dry. To understand this marriage, we must understand the ecosystem in which it grew. Wartime London was the waiting room for the exiled royalties of Europe. King Haakon of Norway, Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands, King George of Greece, they were all there, huddled in luxury hotels like Claridge's and the Ritz, waiting for the British to win the war so they could go home. For Alexandra and her mother Aspasia, this world was both intoxicating and humiliating. They were poor relations. They lived on a stipend, counting pennies while trying to maintain the appearance of royalty. Alexandra volunteered as a nurse, briefly, but mostly she waited. The atmosphere was one of high anxiety and forced gaiety. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow the Nazis might invade. In this hothouse environment, trauma was the common language. Everyone had lost something. Everyone was waiting for a phone call that would restore their power. It was a community of ghosts pretending to be alive. And in this surreal, suspended reality, Alexandra found the only person who was more broken than she was. Enter King Peter II of Yugoslavia. If Alexandra was the cursed princess, Peter was the tragic king. His psychological profile is a mirror image of hers. In 1934, when Peter was only 11 years old, his father, King Alexander I of Yugoslavia, was assassinated in Marseille. The king was shot in a car, on camera, one of the first assassinations captured on newsreel. Peter became king at 11. He was terrified, unprepared, and thrust onto a throne surrounded by sharks, political regents. In 1941, the Nazis invaded Yugoslavia. Peter was forced to flee through the mountains, carrying gold bars in his luggage, eventually escaping to London via a flying boat. When Peter met Alexandra in 1942, at an officers' tea party, they didn't just bond over superficial attraction. They bonded over dead fathers. "My father was killed by a monkey," Alexandra could say. "My father was killed by an assassin," Peter could reply. They were both children of violent public tragedies. They were both raised by domineering mothers. They were both exiles. They recognized the hamartia, fatal weakness, in each other, a profound bottomless loneliness. Peter was shy, socially awkward, and deeply insecure. Alexandra was melancholic and fragile. They didn't fall in love with strength. They fell in love with weakness. They thought that by combining their two broken halves, they could make a whole. It was a romantic delusion. In reality, they were simply doubling the trauma. While the young couple gazed into each other's sad eyes, a master strategist was watching from the shadows. Aspasia Manos. Aspasia saw King Peter not as a traumatized boy, but as a golden ticket. He was a reigning monarch, technically. He was the head of the Karageorgevich dynasty. He was recognized by Churchill and Roosevelt as the legitimate ruler of Yugoslavia. If Alexandra married him, she would be a queen, not a princess of Greece and Denmark, but Her Majesty. The stigma of the commoner blood would be washed away forever. Aspasia went to work. She engineered meetings. She coached Alexandra on how to charm the shy king. She became Peter's confidant, filling the role of the mother figure he desperately needed, since his own mother was distant. Aspasia pushed the match with the ferocity of a woman who sees her last chance at vindication. She ignored the warning signs. She ignored the fact that Peter was emotionally immature. She ignored the fact that Yugoslavia was tearing itself apart in a civil war between Tito's communists and Draža Mihailović's royalists. She only saw the crown, and she wanted it for her daughter. But just as in her own life, Aspasia faced a formidable enemy. Enter Queen Maria of Yugoslavia, Peter's mother. Queen Maria was formidable. She was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria of England and the daughter of Queen Marie of Romania. She was royal to the bone, and she hated the match. Why? History repeats itself with cruel precision. Queen Maria looked at Alexandra and didn't see a sweet girl. She saw Aspasia Manos. She saw the commoner blood. "My son cannot marry the daughter of a Greek colonel," she raged. It was 1919 all over again. The argument was identical to the one Queen Sophia used against Aspasia. Queen Maria argued that Peter should wait until the war was over. "You cannot marry while your country is bleeding," she told him. "You must focus on the war, not on women." This was a valid political point. A lavish royal wedding while Yugoslavs were dying in resistance camps looked bad, but the underlying motive was snobbery. Alexandra found herself in the exact same position her mother had been in, the unwanted bride. The rejection triggered all of Alexandra's childhood insecurities. The wound of the unwanted reopened. She became desperate. She felt that if she didn't marry Peter, she would remain a bastard, and an outcast forever. The romance between Peter and Alexandra was conducted against the backdrop of the V-1 flying bombs, the doodlebugs. There's a strange psychology to wartime romance. The proximity of death acts as an aphrodisiac. It accelerates everything. We might die tonight, so let's get married tomorrow. They spent their days in air raid shelters, holding hands. They whispered promises in darkened nightclubs. Peter, usually weak and indecisive, found a strange backbone in his love for Alexandra. For the first time in his life, he defied his mother. He defied his political advisors. He told them, "I will marry her, or I will abdicate." This is the drama-filled contradiction. Peter was willing to lose his throne for Alexandra. Alexandra wanted him because of his throne, or at least her mother did. It was a misunderstanding of epic proportions. Peter wanted a wife to escape his duty. Alexandra wanted a husband to fulfill her destiny. Aspasia played her final card. She lobbied the British government. She knew that King George VI and Winston Churchill had soft spots for the Greeks. Churchill, the old romantic, eventually gave his blessing. He thought a royal wedding might boost morale. With the British giving the green light, Queen Maria was outmaneuvered. The wedding was on. March 20th, 1944. The venue was the Yugoslav embassy in London. It was not a grand cathedral. There were no crowds cheering in the streets. London was too busy surviving. Alexandra wore a white satin dress. She looked beautiful, fragile, and terrified. Peter wore his Royal Yugoslav Air Force uniform. The guest list was a who's who of exiled royalty. King George VI of England was the best man. King Haakon of Norway was there. Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands was there. And standing triumphantly in the front row was Aspasia Manos. She had won. Her daughter was now a queen. But look at the photos. There is a profound sadness in them. The room feels claustrophobic. The smiles look forced. Outside, the sirens were wailing. Inside, they were celebrating a union that had no foundation. Peter was the king of a country he hadn't seen since he was 17. Alexandra was the queen of a people she had never met, whose language she barely spoke. They were the sovereigns of nowhere. As they exchanged rings, the political ground beneath them was collapsing. In Yugoslavia, the British had shifted their support from the royalist Chetniks to the communist partisans, led by Tito. Churchill, the man who blessed the wedding, was simultaneously signing the death warrant of Peter's monarchy because he needed Stalin's help to win the war. On her wedding day, Alexandra became a queen, but she was investing in a bankrupt company. They went on a brief honeymoon to Scotland. For a few weeks, they played house. They pretended to be a normal young couple, but reality intruded quickly. Peter was constantly on the phone with his ministers, receiving bad news. Tito is gaining power. The Allies are abandoning us. The people are calling for a republic. Alexandra tried to be supportive, but she was ill-equipped. She had been raised to look pretty and speak French, not to be a political strategist. She noticed something else during the honeymoon. Peter drank. He didn't just drink wine with dinner. He drank whiskey in the morning. He drank to numb the terror of his position. He was a boy crushing under the weight of a crown he couldn't hold up. And Alexandra? She responded with her own hamartia, anxiety. She began to obsess over his health. She began to control his food. The anorexia that had been a whisper in her teenage years began to speak louder. She felt the chaos returning. The monkey curse was shape-shifting. It wasn't an animal anymore, it was history itself, coming to devour them. This wedding was not a beginning, it was an end. It was the last gasp of the old European order. By marrying Peter, Alexandra thought she was securing her safety. She thought she was building a fortress against the curse. She didn't realize she had just walked into a burning building. Aspasia Manos had succeeded in making her daughter a queen, but she had failed to ask the most important question: what is a queen without a kingdom? She is just a woman with a fancy title and no job, trapped in a marriage with a man who is slowly destroying himself. The wedding in the ashes was a victory for Aspasia, but a tragedy for Alexandra. She had traded her freedom for a crown made of smoke. And as 1944 turned into 1945, and the war in Europe drew to a close, Alexandra would find herself facing a bizarre new challenge. She was pregnant, and she was about to give birth to an heir for a throne that no longer existed. This leads us to one of the strangest events in international law, a moment where a hotel room becomes a foreign country, which we will explore in the next chapter. In the history of international law, there are very few moments that feel like magic tricks. But on July 17, 1945, in the heart of London, a British Prime Minister waved his wand and redrew the map of Europe for exactly 24 hours. Winston Churchill, with a stroke of a pen, declared that Suite 212 of Claridge's Hotel was no longer England. It was Yugoslavia. Why? To allow a baby to be born on home soil. It sounds charming. It sounds like a gesture of profound respect. But beneath the surface, this event is the ultimate symbol of the absurdity of Alexandra's life. Her son, the Crown Prince, was born in a hotel room that was pretending to be a country for a kingdom that had already ceased to exist in everything but name. This is the story of the Farida, the territory of Room 212, the most expensive, exclusive, and temporary kingdom in the world. And for Alexandra, it was the moment the bizarre curse played its cruelest joke yet, giving her an heir just as it took away her heritage. By early 1945, Queen Alexandra was heavily pregnant. But this was not the glowing, hopeful pregnancy of a monarch expecting an heir. It was a siege. The war in Europe was ending, the Allies were celebrating. But inside the suite at Claridge's, the mood was funereal. King Peter II had lost control. Marshal Tito and his partisans controlled Yugoslavia. The British and Americans, prioritizing the defeat of Hitler, had effectively abandoned the royalist cause. Every telegram that arrived brought more bad news. The king is banned from returning. The royal property is confiscated. Alexandra sat in the middle of this collapse, her body swelling with the future of a dynasty that had no future. Her mental state was deteriorating. The anxiety of the exile that she had known all her life was now compounded by hormonal shifts and the terror of bringing a child into a void. She wasn't knitting booties for a prince. She was preparing a child for a life of homelessness. The monkey curse whispered in her ear, "Chaos is coming. You are not safe." She became obsessed with the legitimacy of the child. Under the Yugoslav constitution, the king must be born on Yugoslav territory to inherit the throne. But they were in London. If the child was born in England, he would be British? Stateless? It was a legal nightmare. Aspasia Manos, the ever-vigilant queenmaker, panicked. If the child wasn't legitimate, the last card in their deck, the dynastic succession, would be worthless. This leads to the intervention of Winston Churchill. Churchill had a deep sense of history and a romantic attachment to royalty. He felt guilty. He knew he had betrayed Peter II politically by supporting Tito. So as a consolation prize, he offered a magic trick. He proposed that for the day of the birth, the British government would cede sovereignty of Suite 212 to Yugoslavia. Technically, legally, the space under the bed, the carpet, the windows, it would all be Yugoslav soil. Boxes of soil from Yugoslavia were reportedly placed under the bed to make it literal. Though some historians debate this detail, the symbolism remains. Think about the philosophy of this. It is a fiction, a lie agreed upon by powerful men. It perfectly encapsulates Alexandra's life, artificial reality. She lived in a garden that pretended to be Eden. She married a king who pretended to rule, and now she was giving birth in a room pretending to be a country. The bizarre curse thrives on this surrealism. The lines between what is real and what is staged were completely blurred. July 17th, 1945. Alexandra went into labor. The doctors arrived, the suite was sealed off, and Crown Prince Alexander II was born. It's a boy. For a brief shining moment, there was joy. The bells of the Serbian Orthodox Church in London rang. King Peter II looked at his son and saw hope. They named him Alexander, after the two tragic grandfathers, Alexandra of Yugoslavia, assassinated, and Alexander of Greece, killed by the monkey. Narrator's note: naming a child after two men who died violently is perhaps tempting fate. It anchored the boy to the tragedy of the past before he even took his first breath. But the joy was ephemeral. The very next day, the magic wore off. Suite 212 became England again. The baby was the Crown Prince of Yugoslavia, but Yugoslavia was gone. In November 1945, just 4 months after the birth, Marshal Tito formally abolished the monarchy. Yugoslavia became a socialist federal republic. Peter II was deposed. He was stripped of his nationality. The baby Alexander was now the crown prince of a memory. Imagine the postpartum experience for Alexandra. Most mothers worry about feeding schedules. Alexandra was worrying about whether they would be kicked out of the hotel. With the throne gone, the British government stopped paying Peter's allowance. The money dried up instantly. They were stuck in one of the most expensive hotels in London with a newborn baby and no income. The gilded poverty that Alexandra had feared all her life had finally caught up with her. The psychological impact of this specific moment, the birth followed by the deposition, cannot be overstated. For Alexandra, it was the ultimate confirmation of the curse. She had done everything right. She had married the king. She had produced the male heir. And the universe laughed at her. You can have the baby, fate seemed to say, but you cannot have the life. This triggered a profound identity crisis. Who was she now? She wasn't a queen, except in name. She wasn't a wife. Peter was already drifting away into alcohol. She was just a mother to a child who represented her failure. She looked at little Alexander and saw the burden of her ambition. She couldn't bond with the baby. She was too consumed by her own terror. She handed the care of the child over to nannies, and eventually to her mother, Aspasia. This is a tragedy of motherhood. Trauma interrupted the bond. She loved him, but she couldn't be with him because he reminded her of everything she had lost. It was in Suite 212, amidst the dirty diapers and the unpaid bills, that Alexandra's mental health began its terminal decline. She developed postpartum depression, but in 1945 there was no name for it. There was no help. She was told to buck up. She was told to be strong for the king. But she was hollowed out. She began to starve herself again. Anorexia returned with a vengeance. It was the only thing she could control. If she couldn't control the borders of Yugoslavia, she could control the borders of her own body. She shrank. She withered. She became the ghost queen. And Peter? Peter couldn't handle her depression. He couldn't handle the crying baby. He couldn't handle the loss of his crown. So he left. Not legally, they remained married, but he left emotionally. He spent his nights in clubs. He found mistresses. He drank until he forgot he was a king. Alexandra was left alone in the hotel room that was no longer a country. Picture Alexandra in late 1945. She is pacing the floor of the suite. She is holding a crying baby. Outside the window, London is rebuilding. The lights are coming back on. The world is moving forward. But in room 212, time has stopped. She is trapped in the amber of her own tragedy. She realizes that the curse isn't just about bad luck, it's about being stuck. She is stuck in a role she cannot play, in a marriage that is dead, in a life that feels like a punishment. Room 212 proves that power is an illusion. Churchill created a country with a signature and destroyed it with a clock. Alexandra realized that her entire life had been built on similar illusions. Her father's power was destroyed by a monkey. Her mother's power was destroyed by a decree. Her husband's power was destroyed by a communist. Nothing is real. Nothing lasts. This nihilism took root in her soul. If nothing matters, why eat? Why fight? Why live? The suicidal ideation that would define her later years began here. It wasn't a dramatic decision. It was a slow erosion of the will to live. She looked at the magic trick of room 212 and realized she was the rabbit in the hat, pulled out for a moment of applause and then shoved back into the darkness. There's a specific kind of silence that fills a marriage when the money runs out and the hope is gone. It is heavier than the silence of a tomb. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, this silence took up permanent residence in the life of Queen Alexandra. She had married King Peter II believing he was her savior. She thought they were two broken halves that would make a whole. But mathematics in tragedy doesn't work that way. Two broken halves just make a pile of debris. This chapter is the autopsy of a marriage. It is the story of how a king turned into a drunk and how a queen turned into a ghost. The bizarre curse that had stalked Alexandra since birth now shifted its shape. It stopped attacking from the outside, monkeys, wars, exiles, and began to attack from the inside. It manifested as vodka bottles hidden in laundry baskets. It manifested as unpaid hotel bills sliding under the door. The fairy tale was over. The nightmare of the real world had begun. To understand Alexandra's mental collapse, we must first analyze the collapse of her primary support system, King Peter II. Peter is a tragic figure, often judged harshly by history as a weak playboy. But let's look at him with the eye of a psychologist. He was a boy who never grew up. His father was assassinated when he was 11. He was king at 11, exiled at 17, married at 20, deposed at 22. By the age of 25, he was a retired monarch with no skills, no country, and a lifetime of trauma. He did what many traumatized men do. He self-medicated. Peter didn't just drink to party. He drank to oblivion. He drank to forget the face of his father in the car in Marseille. He drank to forget the betrayal of Churchill. He drank to forget the disappointing look in his wife's eyes. Alcohol became his kingdom. It was the only place where he was still powerful. For Alexandra, this was a catastrophe. She had projected all her need for security onto Peter. She needed a rock. Instead, she got sand. She would wait up for him in their hotel suite until 3 a.m. When he stumbled in, smelling of whiskey and cheap perfume, it wasn't just a marital argument. It was a confirmation of her deepest fear. I am alone. No one is coming to save me. The monkey curse whispered, "See, chaos always wins. You tried to build a wall against it, and the wall just collapsed." The second prong of the tragedy was financial. Being an exiled royal is incredibly expensive. You are expected to dress like a king, tip like a king, and travel like a king. But you have the income of a beggar. Tito had confiscated the entire Karađorđević fortune in Yugoslavia. Peter and Alexandra were living on the proceeds of selling jewelry. Visualization. Imagine Queen Alexandra sitting at a vanity table in Paris. She opens her jewel box. One by one, The pieces disappear. First the emeralds, then the diamond tiara given by her mother, then the pearls. Every piece of jewelry sold was a piece of her identity chipping away. She was literally consuming her heritage to pay for room service. This gilded poverty is psychologically corrosive. It creates a state of constant high-level anxiety. Alexandra dreaded the sound of a knock at the door, fearing it was a creditor. She had to smile for the cameras, wear the remaining gowns, and pretend everything was fine. This gap between the public image, glamorous royals, and the private reality, destitute exiles, created a cognitive dissonance that fractured her mind. She felt like a fraud, an imposter, and the imposter syndrome is the best friend of mental illness. As if the alcoholism and poverty weren't enough, Peter began to wander. He felt suffocated by Alexandra's anxiety. Her sadness was a mirror he didn't want to look into, so he sought comfort in the arms of women who didn't know his pain, women who were fun, light, and undemanding. He had affairs, many of them, and he wasn't discreet. For Alexandra, this was the ultimate betrayal. She had defied her own family to marry him. She had fought his mother. She had given him an heir, and he replaced her with showgirls. This triggered the wound of the unwanted from her childhood. First, her father left her by dying. Then her extended family rejected her. Now her husband was rejecting her. She began to internalize this rejection. Why does everyone leave me? It must be me. I must be unlovable. I must be defective. This is the logic of depression. It takes the cruelty of the world and turns it into self-hatred. The curse wasn't just bad luck anymore. In her mind, she was the curse. Where was Aspasia Manos during this collapse? Aspasia did what she always did. She tried to manage the situation. She took charge of the grandson, Crown Prince Alexander. She became his primary parent, shielding him from the chaos of his parents' marriage. She tried to talk sense into Peter. She tried to bolster Alexandra. But even the Iron Duchess was powerless against the twin demons of addiction and depression. Aspasia realized with horror that her grand plan had failed. She had wanted a crown for her daughter. Instead, she had shackled her daughter to a sinking corpse. There is a tragic irony here. Aspasia had been the mistress who became a wife. Now she watched her daughter, the wife, being treated like a nuisance. The cycle of royal misery was spinning faster and faster. It was during this period, the late 1940s and early 1950s, that Alexandra's body began to change. She had always been slender, but now she began to disappear. Anorexia nervosa is rarely just about food. It is about control. Alexandra had no control over her husband's drinking. She had no control over their bank account. She had no control over the politics of Yugoslavia. But she could control what she put in her mouth. Starvation became her weapon and her shield. It numbed the pain. When you are starving, you don't feel sad. You just feel empty. It was also a silent scream for help. She couldn't say, "I am dying inside," because queens aren't allowed to complain. So she let her bones speak for her. She became skeletal. Her eyes became huge in her gaunt face. She looked like a ghost, haunting her own life. This is the vivid visual of the era. Alexandra at a gala dinner in Monte Carlo. She is wearing a couture gown that hangs off her frame. She is pushing food around her plate, not eating a bite. Beside her, Peter is downing his 5th glass of wine, laughing too loudly, his arm around the back of another woman's chair. They are the picture of a royal tragedy, the king of excess and the queen of nothingness. In a desperate bid to find purpose and money, Peter decided to move to the United States. He thought he could find work there, or perhaps rally support from the Serbian diaspora. Alexandra followed him. But America was not the land of opportunity for them. It was the land of irrelevance. In Europe, they were exiled majesties. In New York, they were just celebrities. Peter got involved with shady businessmen. He made bad investments. The little money they had left evaporated. Alexandra hated America. She felt further away from her roots than ever. The isolation was total. It was in a hotel room in New York that she first looked at a bottle of sleeping pills and thought, "This is the only way out." The idea of suicide began to seduce her. It wasn't a scary thought, it was a comforting one. It was the only door that was unlocked. Alexandra realized that the love story she had fought for was a lie. She realized that her mother's ambition was a trap. She realized that the curse was winning. The fall of the king was the catalyst for the fall of the queen. Peter's weakness destroyed Alexandra's strength. If he had been strong, she might have survived. She was a follower. She needed a leader. But he led her off a cliff. As the 1950s dawned, Alexandra returned to Europe alone or separated for long periods. She was broken. She was broke. She was sick. She retreated to the only place she knew, the Garden of Eden in Venice. But paradise had changed. It wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was a waiting room for death. And in the bathroom of that villa, the razor blade was waiting. In the archives of European royalty, there are thousands of photographs of Queen Alexandra of Yugoslavia from the 1950s. At a casual glance, she looks like the epitome of mid-century elegance. Tall, poised, draped in couture, usually wearing dark sunglasses. But if you look closer, if you look with the eye of a forensic investigator, you begin to see the horror hiding in plain sight. The wrists are not just slender, they are brittle. The cheekbones are not just high, they are protruding like razor blades. The eyes are not just mysterious, they are sunken into a skull that seems to be pushing through the skin. By the mid-1950s, Alexandra of Greece, a woman who stood nearly 5 feet 10 inches tall, weighed less than 80 pounds. That is roughly 36 kilograms. To put that in perspective, it is the weight of a child. This was not a diet. It was not a fashion statement. It was a slow-motion suicide broadcast in the society pages of newspapers. This is the story of the skeleton in the closet, the terrifying chapter where the bizarre curse stopped attacking her circumstances and began to consume her flesh. It is the story of a queen who decided that if she could not rule a kingdom, she would tyrannize her own biology until there was nothing left to rule. To understand the magnitude of Alexandra's illness, we must first strip away the stigma that surrounds it. In the 1950s, the term anorexia nervosa existed in medical textbooks, but it was virtually unknown to the general public. There were no clinics, no support groups, no Instagram posts about body positivity. If a woman wasted away, it was whispered about as a nervous condition or a glandular problem. Alexandra was suffering in a vacuum of ignorance. She was fighting a lethal psychiatric disorder, while the world applauded her for being fashionably slim. The decline began slowly, almost imperceptibly, in the chaos of her collapsing marriage to King Peter. Food became the enemy. In a life defined by uncontrollable variables, revolutions, exiles, bankruptcies, food was the one variable she could manipulate with absolute precision. She began to view hunger not as a sensation of pain, but as a sensation of purity. When she was hungry, she felt light, she felt clean. She felt superior to the messy, chaotic needs of the human body. The detective looking at her daily routine in Paris or Venice would notice a disturbing pattern. She would sit at a banquet table, moving a single piece of lettuce around her plate for 2 hours. She would claim to have eaten earlier. She would hide food in napkins, in vases, in pockets. It was a covert operation, a secret war she was waging against her own survival instinct. And she was winning. The pounds melted away, taking with them her energy, her menstruation, and eventually her rationality. She was disappearing inch by inch, and nobody knew how to stop her. Why? This is the question that haunts every biography of Alexandra. Why would a beautiful woman, a queen, destroy her own beauty? The answer lies deep in the psychology of the monkey curse. Remember the origin of her trauma, the randomness of the monkey bite. Her father died because of a chaotic, uncontrollable infection. Alexandra internalized the idea that the world is a dangerous place where foreign invaders, bacteria, politics, other women can destroy you at any moment. Anorexia was her fortress. By refusing food, she was sealing the borders of her body. She was creating a hermetic seal against the world. If nothing goes in, nothing can hurt me. It was a desperate attempt to create a zone of total safety. In her starved state, the world slowed down. The emotions that overwhelmed her, the grief for her father, the rage at her husband, the shame of her poverty, were blunted. Starvation acts as a numbing agent. It turns the volume down on the screaming in your head. Furthermore, we must look at the hamartia of her mother, Aspasia. Aspasia had raised Alexandra to be an object of perfection, a doll to be dressed and displayed. Alexandra felt that her value lay entirely in her appearance. When her marriage failed, she felt she had lost her value. Anorexia became a twisted way to reclaim that value. She would become the most slender, the most disciplined, the most ethereal. She was trying to perfect herself into non-existence. She wanted to become a spirit because being a human was too painful. The epicenter of this tragedy was, once again, the Garden of Eden in Venice. After the disastrous sojourn in America and the disintegration of her relationship with Peter, Alexandra retreated to her mother's villa. But the dynamic had shifted. Aspasia Manos, the Iron Duchess, was now the terrified mother of a dying child. Aspasia would cook elaborate meals, begging Alexandra to eat. She would plead, threaten, and cry. But Alexandra, the fragile glass princess, had found a weapon that could defeat her mother's will. She could simply close her mouth. For the first time in her life, Alexandra held the power. Aspasia couldn't force her. The queen-maker was helpless before the queen who refused to be fed. The villa became a battleground of wills. The tension was suffocating. Servants would find untouched trays of food hidden in wardrobes. They would hear Aspasia screaming in frustration and Alexandra weeping in exhaustion. The vivid visuals of this period are Gothic in their intensity. Imagine the vast, overgrown garden of the villa, a place of lush, exploding life. And walking through it is Alexandra, a skeletal figure in a black coat, shivering even in the summer heat because she has no body fat to keep her warm. She looked like a specter haunting her own paradise. The locals in Giudecca began to cross themselves when they saw her. She was no longer the fairy tale princess. She was the Morti, death, walking on two legs. One of the most disturbing aspects of this period was how Alexandra managed to maintain her public facade. She was still a queen, and she still had social obligations. She attended balls in Paris, weddings in London, and galas in Monte Carlo. How did she hide the skeleton? She used fashion as armor. Alexandra was a master of camouflage. She wore Dior's new look, voluminous skirts that hid her wasted hips, long sleeves that hid her stick-like arms, and high collars that hid her protruding collarbones. She used makeup to contour her gaunt face, turning the hollows of starvation into chic cheekbones. She wore oversized sunglasses to hide the dead look in her eyes. The society press, often cruel but sometimes willfully blind, conspired in this deception. They described her as willowy or fragile. They praised her ethereal beauty. They didn't want to admit that one of their own was decomposing before their eyes. To admit she was sick would be to admit that the royal dream was a nightmare. So they applauded the skeleton in the silk dress. But there were moments when the mask slipped. At a dinner party in Paris, it is whispered that she fainted while trying to stand up for a toast. Her body simply gave out. She was carried out like a bundle of dry twigs. The guests murmured, blamed the heat, blamed the champagne, and went back to their caviar. The bizarre curse of isolation meant that even when she collapsed in a room full of people, she was fundamentally alone. We must not shy away from the medical reality of what Alexandra was doing to herself. At 36 kilograms, the human body enters a state of emergency. The heart muscle atrophies, beating slower and slower to conserve energy. The hair falls out. The skin becomes dry and papery. The brain, starved of glucose, enters a permanent fog. Alexandra lived in a state of delirium. She was hallucinating. She was paranoid. The lack of nutrients exacerbated her existing depression, creating a feedback loop of mental illness. She couldn't think clearly enough to save herself. She was trapped in the logic of the disease. She believed that if she ate a single crouton, she would become fat. And if she became fat, she would be out of control. Her son, Crown Prince Alexander, was a young boy during these years. He watched his mother fade away. He later spoke of the confusion and terror of seeing his beautiful mother turn into a stranger. He was raised largely by his grandmother Aspasia and nannies because Alexandra was too weak to be a mother. She spent days in bed, curtains drawn, saving her energy for nothing. She was preserving a life she didn't want to live. This connects back to the theme of the bizarre curse. The monkey bite killed her father by infection, an invasion of the body. Alexandra was killing herself by negation, a denial of the body. It was an inverted reflection of the same tragedy. The father died of too much life bacteria. The daughter was dying of too little. As we reach the depths of this chapter, we arrive at the philosophical core of Alexandra's anorexia. Why did she want to disappear? Because she felt she had no right to exist. Remember her birth? Born posthumously, 5 months after a tragedy. She was the afterthought. Remember her childhood, exiled, homeless, unwanted by her grandmother. Remember her marriage, a wife replaced by mistresses, a queen without a country. Every signal the world gave her was, "You do not belong here. You are a mistake." Anorexia was her way of agreeing with the world. She was trying to rectify the mistake of her existence by erasing herself. It was a metaphysical suicide. She didn't want to die violently like her father. She wanted to fade away like a mist. She wanted to become light, to become air, to become nothing. There is a tragic nobility in her madness. She was trying to solve the problem of her pain by removing the vessel that held it. If she had no body, she could feel no pain. If she had no heart, it couldn't be broken by Peter. If she had no stomach, it couldn't knot with anxiety. She was trying to transcend her humanity because her humanity had been nothing but a source of suffering. By the late 1950s, the situation was critical. Doctors warned Aspasia that Alexandra's heart could stop at any moment. She was living on borrowed time. The skeleton in the closet could no longer be hidden. The whisper network in Europe knew. The Queen of Yugoslavia is dying, but death by starvation is slow, and the bizarre curse had a crueler ending in mind for her. It wouldn't let her slip away quietly in her sleep. That would be too peaceful. The curse demanded drama. It demanded blood. As Alexandra lay in her darkened room in Venice, realizing that starvation was taking too long, her mind turned to faster methods. The passive suicide of anorexia wasn't working fast enough to escape the pain. She needed something sharper. She needed something final. The transition from the skeleton to the razor was inevitable. The war against her body was about to escalate from a siege to a direct assault. There is a specific, terrifying intimacy to a bathroom. It is the only room in a royal life where the doors are locked, where the guards are outside, and where the masks come off. For Queen Alexandra of Yugoslavia, the bathroom became her sanctuary and her torture chamber. In the silence of tiled rooms in Paris and Venice, the phantom queen finally tried to make herself a ghost for real. We have watched her starve. We have watched her weep. Now we must watch her bleed. This chapter is not for the faint of heart. It is the story of the razor in the bath. It documents the moment when the bizarre curse escalated from a metaphorical haunting to a physical butchery. It explores the dark, desperate logic of suicide, not as a cowardly act, but as the final frantic attempt of a trapped animal to chew off its own leg to escape the trap. Alexandra didn't want to die. She just wanted the noise in her head to stop. And when the starvation didn't silence the voices of her past, she reached for something sharper. The first major incident took place in Paris, the city of lights, which for Alexandra had become the city of shadows. It was the early 1960s. The marriage to King Peter II was effectively over, though neither would admit it legally. Peter was lost in a haze of alcohol and other women. Alexandra was lost in the fog of anorexia and depression. They were staying in a luxury hotel, maintaining the facade of a royal couple on tour. But inside the suite, the atmosphere was poisonous. The detective reconstructing this scene sees a woman pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. The argument that night was likely about money or infidelity or perhaps just the sheer crushing weight of their mutual failure. Peter stormed out, perhaps to a bar, perhaps to a mistress. Alexandra was left alone. The silence of the hotel room was deafening. The monkey curse that had killed her father seemed to be laughing at her from the shadows. She felt the walls closing in. She felt that she was a burden to her mother, a disappointment to her son, and a joke to her husband. She went into the bathroom. She locked the door. She took a razor blade, perhaps one of Peter's, a cruel irony that the instrument of her destruction belonged to the man she loved, and she cut. She didn't make a cry for help scratch. She cut deep. She cut to die. The visual is stark. The white porcelain, the steam on the mirror, and the bright red blood pooling on the floor. It was a violent rebellion against the glass menagerie she had been raised in. Her mother had taught her to be perfect, pristine, and composed. This was the messiest, most primal act possible. It was a shattering of the doll. She was found, of course. The maid, or perhaps a returning Peter or a worried friend, broke down the door. The chaos that followed was a blur of screaming towels and sirens. But here is the bizarre curse at work. She didn't die. The ambulance arrived too quickly. The doctors were too skilled. She was stitched up, transfused, and brought back to the life she tried so hard to leave. She woke up in a hospital bed, not in the peace of oblivion, but in the harsh fluorescent light of survival. The curse wasn't done with her yet. It demanded more suffering. If Paris was a tragedy, the subsequent attempts in Venice were a pattern. Alexandra returned to the Garden of Eden, her mother's villa, but the garden offered no peace. The demons had followed her across the Alps. The suicide attempt in Paris had broken a taboo. Once you cross that line, once you look death in the face and invite him in, it becomes easier to do it again. The threshold of fear is lowered. In Venice, the attempts became a grim routine. There were overdoses of sleeping pills. There were more incidents with sharp objects. As Spasiamenos, the Iron Duchess, was forced into the role of jailer. She had to remove locks from doors. She had to search Alexandra's room for pills. She had to watch her daughter like a hawk. Imagine the horror of that existence. Aspasia had fought the Greek government, the royal family, and the British Empire to make her daughter a queen. Now she was fighting her daughter to keep her alive, the locals in Giudecca whispered. They saw the ambulances coming and going across the lagoon. The legend of the cursed queen grew. They said she was haunted by the ghost of her father, Alexander. They said the monkey bite had infected the bloodline with madness. And in a way, they were right. The trauma was genetic. It had mutated from a physical infection in the father to a mental infection in the daughter. The most heartbreaking victim of this phase was not Alexandra herself, but her son, Crown Prince Alexander. He was a teenager during these years. He was at boarding school in Switzerland and England, but he would visit his mother during holidays. What he saw changed him forever. He didn't walk into a palace filled with joy. He walked into a house of horrors. He saw his mother emaciated, weighing 36 kilograms, looking like a skeleton. He saw the bandages on her wrists. He heard the hushed conversations between the doctors and his grandmother. He lived in constant terror that the next phone call would be the call. For a young boy, this is a catastrophic burden. He became the parent to his parents. He had to be the strong one. He had to comfort his grandmother, Aspasia, who was crumbling under the stress. He had to visit his father, Peter, who was often drunk and weeping. And he had to sit by his mother's bed holding her fragile hand, begging her to eat, begging her to live. This is the legacy of the curse. It steals childhoods. Alexandra had no childhood because of her father's death. Now her son had no childhood because of her illness. The trauma was being passed down like a family heirloom. The visual of the young prince standing in the hallway of the Venetian villa, listening to his mother weep behind a locked door, is the emotional core of this tragedy. He was the innocent bystander caught in the crossfire of his family's history. We must also analyze the detective aspect of how this was handled by the world. In the 1960s, mental illness and suicide were deeply stigmatized, especially for royalty. A queen does not slit her wrists. A queen does not have a nervous breakdown. A queen is a symbol of stability. Therefore, a massive cover-up operation was launched. The official statements released by the family or their press secretaries never mentioned suicide. They spoke of nervous exhaustion, insomnia, or accidental overdose of sedatives. They blamed the stress of exile. They sanitized the horror. This conspiracy of silence protected the dignity of the monarchy, but it destroyed the dignity of the woman. It denied Alexandra the validation of her pain. By refusing to name her illness, severe depression, and suicidality, they prevented her from getting real help. She was treated in private clinics in Switzerland and France, often under pseudonyms. She was subjected to the treatments of the era: heavy sedation, perhaps electroconvulsive therapy, shock treatment, and isolation. She was treated like a broken appliance that needed to be fixed quietly and put back on the shelf. No one addressed the root cause, the bizarre curse of her displacement, the lack of purpose, the unresolved grief of her father's death. They treated the symptoms, the bleeding, the starvation, but ignored the disease, the existential void. Why did she survive? This is the philosophical question that haunts Part 7. Alexandra made multiple serious attempts on her life. She was frail, weak, and determined. Statistically, she should have died, but she didn't. Was it luck? Was it the intervention of doctors? Or was it the curse? There is a cruel interpretation here. The curse of the monkey bite was not just about death, it was about suffering. If Alexandra had died in that Paris bathroom, Her suffering would have ended. She would have found peace, but the curse wouldn't allow that. It forced her to live. It dragged her back from the brink of death time and time again, forcing her to endure the humiliation of recovery, the shame of the scars, and the continued agony of her mental illness. She was trapped in a limbo of the cursed. She wasn't fully alive because she was starving and depressed, but she wasn't allowed to be dead. She was a prisoner of her own biology. She became like a figure from Greek mythology, Prometheus chained to the rock, having his liver eaten every day, only for it to grow back so he could be tortured again. Alexandra cut her wrist, was stitched up, healed, and then the despair would return and the cycle would repeat. These suicide attempts were the final axe blow to the marriage of Peter and Alexandra. King Peter II was a man of limited emotional capacity. He was already drowning in his own addiction. He simply did not have the strength to deal with a suicidal wife. The sight of her blood, the chaos of the ambulances, the sheer intensity of her despair terrified him. He pulled away completely. He stopped visiting Venice. He moved permanently to the United States and later to other parts of Europe before settling in the U.S., leaving Alexandra in the care of her mother. He essentially filed for a psychological divorce. He abandoned her to her demons because he was too busy fighting his own. This abandonment confirmed Alexandra's deepest delusion, that she was toxic, that she destroyed everyone she loved. Her father died touching a monkey to save a dog. Her husband fled across the ocean to escape her sadness. She felt like a radioactive isotope, poisoning the environment around her. By the late 1960s, the acute phase of the suicide attempts began to fade, replaced by a dull, chronic catatonia. Alexandra stopped trying to kill herself actively and returned to the passive suicide of neglect. She lived in a twilight state, heavily medicated, drifting through the rooms of the Garden of Eden. She had become the ghost of Venice. The beautiful young princess who had charmed London in the Blitz was gone. In her place was a scarred, silent woman who jumped at shadows. She had scars on her wrists, permanent bracelets of her pain that she hid under long sleeves and diamond cuffs. Tragedy is usually defined by noise. It screams, it shatters, it explodes. We think of the monkey bite that killed a king, the air raid sirens of the London Blitz, or the desperate wail of ambulances rushing to a Venetian villa. But the true end of a tragedy is almost always silent. By the 1970s, the screaming in Queen Alexandra's life had finally stopped. The arguments with King Peter were over. The frantic, domineering instructions of her mother had fallen silent. The cursed queen entered the final act of her life, not as a monarch, nor as a wife, nor even as a daughter. She entered it as a ghost haunting a world that had moved on without her. She was the sole survivor of the wreckage. The monkey had killed her father. The exile had killed her country. The alcohol had killed her husband. The ambition had killed her mother. But Alexandra remained, like a piece of driftwood left on the shore after the hurricane has passed. This final chapter is the story of the ghost of Venice and the recluse of East Sussex. It is the chronicle of a woman who spent the last 20 years of her life waiting for permission to die, trapped in a body she hated in a history she couldn't escape. And finally, we must deliver the verdict. Was she truly cursed by fate, or was she simply the most tragic victim of the 20th century's collapse? The disintegration of Alexandra's world began in earnest in 1970, with the collapse of the first pillar of her existence. King Peter II of Yugoslavia died in a hospital in Denver, Colorado. He was only 47 years old. It was a wretched, lonely end for a man who had been crowned a king while still a child. His liver, assaulted by decades of relentless drinking, finally failed him. A transplant was attempted, but his body was too weak to accept it. He died penniless, thousands of miles away from the Balkan mountains he was born to rule, and the Greek princess he had sworn to love. For Alexandra, the news was a complex, suffocating trauma. This was the man she had defied empires to marry. This was the father of her son. But he was also the man who had abandoned her to her demons. His death confirmed the cruel pattern that the bizarre curse had etched into her life. The men she loves do not stay. Her father died before she was born, and now her husband had died in middle age. She was a widow at 49, echoing the fate of her mother, Aspasia. But unlike the iron widow Aspasia, who turned her grief into a weapon of ambition, Alexandra turned her grief into further isolation. She did not possess the strength to fly to America for the funeral. She did not stand by the gravesite in Libertyville, Illinois, where Peter became the only European monarch to be buried on American soil. She was too frail, too sick, and too mentally shattered to face the cameras. Instead, she mourned him from the shadows of Venice, remembering the shy boy with the sad eyes she had met in London during the war, trying to forget the bloated, broken wreck he had become in the end. His death severed her last link to the role of queen, leaving her with nothing but the title and the memories. 2 years later, in 1972, the second and most critical pillar of her life collapsed. Aspasia Manos died. The Queenmaker, the Iron Duchess, the woman who had fought the entire world to give Alexandra a name, was gone. This was the catastrophic blow that finally untethered Alexandra from reality. Aspasia had been more than a mother. She had been Alexandra's manager, her jailer, her nurse, and her conscience. Aspasia had told her when to eat, when to sleep, what to wear, and who to be. At 51 years old, Alexandra was technically a middle-aged woman, but psychologically she remained a dependent child. With Aspasia gone, the Garden of Eden in Venice, once a gilded cage, felt terrifyingly empty. The silence was deafening. The villa was filled with the echoes of Aspasia's ambition, and Alexandra could not bear to live in the museum of her mother's dreams. She sold the villa. She packed her bags, and with them the ghosts of her past, and moved to England. The choice of England was significant. It was the only place that felt neutral. It wasn't the Greece that had rejected her as a bastard, nor the Yugoslavia that had deposed her as a queen. It was the land of Room 212, the only place where she had briefly held the promise of a future. She retreated to a house in East Sussex, seeking the anonymity of the English countryside. In East Sussex, Queen Alexandra effectively disappeared. For the next 20 years, she became a hermit. She refused to see visitors, declined all requests for interviews, and shunned the royal circus of European weddings and christenings. She lived in a darkened house, the curtains perpetually drawn against the sun, surrounded by silver-framed photographs of the dead. Her mental health stabilized, but only in a grim, vegetative way. The frantic, bloody suicide attempts of the Venetian years stopped, but only because she had stopped living in any meaningful sense. She existed in a state of suspended animation. Her eating disorders continued to plague her, but they settled into a chronic, low-level starvation. She remained skeletal, frail, living on a diet that would barely sustain a bird, sipping tea and staring at the walls. To her neighbors, she was a myth. They knew a queen lived in the big house behind the gates, but they never saw her. She became the Miss Havisham of royalty, emotionally frozen in 1944, still wearing the psychological wedding dress of a bride who believed her life was about to begin. Her son, Crown Prince Alexander, visited her often. He was now a grown man, a businessman trying to reclaim his own destiny and rehabilitate the family name. He saw his mother fading by degrees. He realized that the monkey curse had finally run its course. It had stripped her of everything: her beauty, her power, her love, her family. All that was left was a faint, stubborn heartbeat. On January 30th, 1993, Queen Alexandra of Yugoslavia died in East Sussex. She was 71 years old. The medical cause was cancer, but a philosopher would argue she died of exhaustion. She had been tired for 71 years. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible end to a life that had begun with such violent noise. There were no monkeys attacking from the trees. There were no assassins. There were no razor blades. There was just a final, long exhale, as if she were finally putting down a heavy suitcase she had carried since birth. But even in death, the bizarre curse of displacement played one last, cruel trick. Alexandra was a queen without a country, a woman without a home. So the question arose, where do you bury her? She had no soil of her own. Initially, she was taken back to Greece to the Tatoi Palace and buried near her parents, Alexander and Aspasia. It seemed like a poetic ending. She was finally reunited with the father she never knew, resting in the very garden where the monkey had attacked him. The circle appeared to be closed, but history wasn't done with her. 20 years later, in 2013, the political winds in Serbia shifted. The royal family was rehabilitated, and her son, Crown Prince Alexander, wanted his parents home. He exhumed King Peter II from the clay of Illinois. He exhumed Queen Alexandra from the earth of Greece. He exhumed his grandmother, Queen Maria, from England. He brought them all to Serbia. On May 26, 2013, Queen Alexandra was buried for the second time. She was laid to rest in the royal mausoleum of Oplenak. She was finally buried in the country she was queen of, a country she had never set foot in while she was alive, except for that singular day in a London hotel room. Even as a corpse, she couldn't stay still. She remained the eternal refugee, shuffled from grave to grave, a pawn in the politics of the living until the very end. Now, having walked through the wreckage of this life, we must deliver the verdict. Was Alexandra of Greece truly cursed? If we look through the lens of superstition, the answer seems to be yes. The monkey bite was a demonic intervention that poisoned the bloodline, creating a cascade of misery that no human could withstand. But if we look with the eyes of a detective and a philosopher, the answer is far more terrifying. Alexandra was not the victim of a supernatural curse. She was the victim of untreated, compounded trauma. Her life serves as a stark case study in how trauma, when left to fester, destroys the human soul. First, there was the trauma of origin. She was born into a womb flooded with grief. Her nervous system was wired for anxiety before she even took her first breath. Then came the trauma of displacement. A human being cannot thrive without roots, and Alexandra was a plant trying to grow in concrete, constantly moved from hotel to hotel, never allowed to feel safe. There was the trauma of ambition, inflicted by a mother who used her as a tool for revenge, never allowing her to be a person, only a symbol. And finally, the trauma of abandonment, as every man who was supposed to protect her, her father, her grandfather, her husband, failed her, either by dying or by drinking. The monkey was just the catalyst. The real killer was the silence. It was the silence of the doctors who didn't amputate the king's leg because they feared protocol more than death. It was the silence of the family who shunned the child because of her mother's blood. It was the silence of the society that watched a woman starve herself to 36 kilograms and called it fashionable. It was the silence of the stigma that hid her depression under the rug of nervous exhaustion. Alexandra's life proves that mental illness is the most effective curse of all. It is invisible. It is hereditary in the way it shapes behavior. And it is lethal. She spent 71 years trying to escape the pain of being the cursed child. She tried to escape through marriage and failed. She tried to escape through titles and failed. She tried to escape through starvation and failed. She tried to escape through suicide and failed. Only death finally gave her the one thing she chased her entire life: safety. What did she leave behind? She left a son, Crown Prince Alexander, who performed the ultimate miracle. He broke the cycle. He grew up to be a stable, happy man with a loving family, defeating the curse by surviving it. But beyond her family, she left a cautionary tale for history. She is the dark mirror of the royal fairy tale. We look at Cinderella and see the happy ending. We look at Alexandra and see what happens when the glass slipper doesn't fit. But the mother forces it on anyway, cutting off the toes to make it work, leaving a trail of blood on the palace steps. Alexandra of Greece had blue blood, she had diamonds, and she had crowns. But she died starving for the one thing money cannot buy and titles cannot command: the feeling that she had a right to exist. She was a woman who apologized for her life by slowly erasing herself from it. And that is the tragic, terrifying, and heartbreaking story of Queen Alexandra of Yugoslavia, the queen born from a monkey bite, the queen who lived in a hotel room, the queen who starved in a palace. Her life asks us a brutal question: how much trauma can one person inherit before they break? Alexandra carried the weight of a dead father, an exiled mother, and a fallen kingdom. She broke so that her son didn't have to. If this deep dive into the darkest corners of royal psychology touched you, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps us bring these forgotten ghosts back into the light so their stories can finally be heard. Tell me in the comments, do you think she was a victim of her mother, her husband, or simply bad luck? Thank you for watching the story of the cursed queen. Rest in peace, Alexandra. The war is over,